Australia is 11 weeks into a groundbreaking legal ban on under 16s using social media, and multiple countries around the world are planning to follow suit. Already, just in the last couple of days, Meta's reported that it's removed 544,052 underage accounts from Instagram, Facebook, and Threads accounts for kids under 16 here in Australia. So far, the focus here has been on addiction and on impacts on education. But my guest today is sharing a much darker story from his own research and from data deep inside unredacted court papers in the US. Nathan Witkin is a research writer at the New York University Stern Tech and Society Lab, and he first published this work in After Babel, the Substack of renowned global expert and author on social media harms, Jonathan Haidt. The court papers allege that Meta leadership knowingly exposed teens, and particularly young women and girls, en masse to human traffickers and predators in order to protect its bottom line. And we're about to see Meta's latest financials. So today, thank you, Nathan. Thank you so much for joining me, and thank you for your work. Perhaps
Of course.
we could.
Thank you so much for having me, Ricky. Sorry to interrupt.
No, I'm interrupting you. I'm keen to get to the details here. Perhaps you can give everyone a sense of the scale of the harms here. What are we talking about?
Absolutely. So, for just a bit of further context, this is information that we're gathering from unsealed court filings connected to litigation by several different school districts in the United States against Meta. And these came out on November 21st. There was some coverage of them, but sort of not nearly as much as you'd expect, given the severity of some of the revelations inside. So to get just a picture of the scale, I'm just going to read some direct quotes from the filing, just to start us off on some
Please
context.
do. And to be clear, it's a massive filing, right? So we're talking tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of words. Yeah,
absolutely. So one of the things that we learned in this filing comes from Meta's own research. In fact, many of the things we learned come from their research. And I'm just going to read this quote out. At one point in 2023, the Instagram feature Accounts You May Follow recommended nearly 2 million minors to adult groomers in the previous 3 months. On top of that, the same filing also discusses an internal 2022 audit, which found that Accounts You May Follow recommended 1.4 million potential IIC violators. That's sort of Facebook speak for inappropriate interactions with children to teenage users in a single day.
Sorry, just give me those numbers again. In a day. Just give me the number again.
So I'll read that out one more time. Recommended 1.4 million potential IIC violators, child predators, essentially, to teenage users in a single day. And so that's, you're getting up into the hundreds of millions, if not billions, over the span of time we're talking about here. And this filing's particularly interested in the period from about 2015 onward.
That's quite astonishing. So the allegation then is that Meta knew about this behavior, but didn't do anything about it. How do the court papers kind of prove that?
Yeah. So there's a ton of information on that fact exactly. So a few things to say here. The first would be that you have all of this internal safety research going on at Meta that's reaching leadership about the scale of what's happening here. And what I quoted just now is coming directly from Meta documents that were unearthed during discovery. And that's what we're finding out from these filings.
So if I could just stop you there, and I just want to really copper bottom this for everybody listening. So these aren't allegations that they're coming out of your own research. These are court paper documents for quoting and using internal emails from within Meta that have been subpoenaed from them for this court action that are now in unredacted court papers. And these are verbatim accounts from actual Meta employees talking about the research that they've got. So this is solid information.
Oh yeah, and I think that's something I also want to underline too, is just that, there's no ambiguity about the facts here, because all of this information that we have is coming straight from quotes, straight from Meta documents unearthed during discovery. And we, know that they were aware of these problems. We also know that they sort of went all the way to the top. that people like Mark Zuckerberg and Adam Mosseri were aware about the scale of interaction between child predators and children on their platforms, and made explicit decisions not to move forward with the correctives that were suggested by safety researchers. And those include things like default private accounts for teens, which would essentially prevent them from being recommended interactions with strangers or from receiving messages from strangers. So there were pilot programs for things like private accounts for teens, which now exist in some form, although as maybe we can visit later, they don't work very well still. That was all sort of on the table. It was known that were those accounts implemented, you would have prevented millions of these interactions, including direct messages between child predators and children. And still, the decision was made that because you would lose out on engagement from teens, and I'll just pause there and say that a critical piece of context here that I also want to underline is that a lot of this push to get more teens on the platform is coming from competition between major social media companies. So a major reason you see harm at this scale is because in the aftermath of TikTok being released, and even before that, when some of Meta's numbers among younger users weren't looking too pretty, they decided this is existential for us. We need to make a massive push into the teen market. And so they're aware of what they're doing here. Internal research is finding this. Researchers are saying we have to stop this, and we have to stop this by defaulting teen accounts to private. And repeatedly, leadership as well as the growth team, whose responsibility is to try and maximize these engagement metrics, are saying, we just can't afford to lose this engagement, right? And it's engagement that they know is in many cases coming from conversations, profile visits, likes, reposts happening across accounts of children on the one hand, and people that internally they'd be calling IIC violators on the other hand. IIC, again, meaning inappropriate interactions with children. So it's a euphemism for child predators. And so there's a conscious decision made at a very high level, and there's no factual dispute here, that we are not, as Meta, going to prevent these interactions. We're going to allow them to happen. And the reason we can't prevent them is it would hurt our bottom line at a time when we're competing with other major social media companies. So that's a window into the scale. Yeah.
Amazing. So to validate this, I've also read the court papers. They run to more than 5 million words. There are vast tranches of data. One of the most enlightening pieces for me was the deposition of one of the safety people that's there, who's since quit and become a whistleblower, okay, Arturo Behar. And so that his deposition was quite astonishing and very stark. And I'll publish some of the verbatim accounts from it over the coming weeks as we dive deeper into this investigation. But he very clearly said, look, we have a problem here. You're measuring the likelihood of something bad happening. But what I have is the data of the actual proof of something bad happening.
Yes.
And they were saying, yeah, but we're working on it because we're looking at what the risk is. And he's saying, no. I've got the actual numbers. And it went all the way to Mark Zuckerberg, and still nothing was done on that. What was your take on that?
Yeah, and I remember us having that conversation. And I think one of my big takeaways is that people in the position of Zuckerberg and Mosseri, Sheryl Sandberg, other people at the top of...
let's just make it clear to everybody who these people are.
Sure,
So Adam
absolutely.
Mosseri is the CEO of Instagram, correct?
Mm-hmm.
And Sheryl Sandberg's no longer at the company, but she was the COO, or the chief operating officer, at the time.
Yeah, thank you. And so I think that, for all these people, they know in the back of their heads that things like this are happening on their platforms, and not just happening, but being facilitated by the platforms, right? Because it's important to recognize that, it's not the case that if kids are not on Meta platforms, they're going to be interacting with a lot of these same people. Because in a lot of cases, these people are strangers. They're being recommended to them by algorithmic systems that there's no real world analog to. Right. And so a lot of this is just not happening if you don't have kids on these platforms. And so this is something, like we talked about, that leadership is aware of. But it's all screened, like you're saying, through these very abstract, sort of euphemistic metrics. A lot of them are probabilistic, sort of, rather than absolute, meaning that they say, okay, there's, an 80% likelihood, a 50% likelihood that you have X number of interactions between children and IIC violators over this period of time. Right. But you have people like Arturo Behar, who can dig, like you say, much more deeply and see like, no, here's actually what these interactions look like. Like this is a chat log between, hypothetically a 14-year-old girl and a 50-year-old child predator that we also know is a child predator because we have algorithms to track who is an IIC violator, so-called, and who is not. So we know this, you have safety researchers that are looking directly at this information, but people at the top, I think because they probably have some level of guilty conscience about it, they don't want to actually see directly what is happening in all the nitty gritty, right? They want the metrics. And that's a way to sort of push out the human elements and they continue optimizing the bottom line instead.
All right. So one of the most powerful, as a journalist, one of the most powerful things in the world when you're trying to reveal incredibly difficult information, especially about very powerful people and corporations, is that eventually it usually ends up in a court case. And as soon as it's a court case, then you have some legal cover for talking about these issues and you can start to talk about them in the open. Okay. And what sometimes happens is that you find that the court papers and documents start to kind of match or get close to what you're seeing in independent research that people have hypothesized about or have talked about or have tried to break a story in some way. When a vast tract of data like this drops into effectively the public arena through these court papers, it gives us the ability to report very much more closely and more with greater definition of exactly what these
Yeah.
problems are. And so can I just ask you, let's talk about some headline numbers.
Yeah.
We are talking about, let's be clear, millions of children, underage children, sitting on these platforms, being approached. How many times was it per day?
Yeah, so millions of interactions. And just for context, that can mean just an account being recommended. It doesn't always have to be a message, but at the same time, they do have internal research that's specific to unwanted messages. Now, they don't always have to be unwanted messages of a sexual nature, but we know that from some of their safety researchers that installing this private by default feature for teens would have also stopped millions of unwanted messages. So you can assume that we're not just only talking about account recommendations, we're really talking about interaction.
Oh yeah, because in his sworn deposition, the Arturo Behar, the safety guy, literally created accounts posing as underage girls, and then put them out in the same way as a normal member of the public would, and then he recorded all the interactions that came back, and I have all those, and so I'll publish some of those. So it's very, very clear that these are sexual and unwanted. There's hate speech, there's body shaming, there's bullying.
Yeah. And just to add on to that, because there's similar information in this filing, sort of one of the more macabre details is that they're also doing internal research where they look at the other side, so to speak, where they make accounts that are actively trying to simulate the experience of a child predator who is looking to find content sexualizing children. And they see how fast you get this recommended to you with really no barriers at all. And the same thing happens on both ends, right? So on the one hand, you have Behar, who is starting accounts that are meant to simulate being a child on the platform. You also have safety researchers who are starting accounts meant to simulate being an adult on the platform. And on both ends, you have recommendations on the children's end to interact with people that are known child predators. You have recommendations on the end of at least simulated predators themselves to find children and to find content that's sexualizing children.
All right. So there'll be parents on this call. They'll certainly, on this video, there will certainly be parents that will read this as we publish it. This is frankly terrifying. This is a social media platform. Everybody kind of knows, all the way back to Frances Horgans, who was another whistleblower for former Meta executive and whistleblower, that this has been a problem for some time and that it's been a recognized problem. But we haven't really seen the extent of it until now. I think this is the first time we've really seen these numbers. And I want to go to a number that I saw from you in your report that you did on Jonathan Haidt's Substack. And you said, and I quote, 23% of all sex trafficking victims who appear in federal court cases in the US were recruited from Meta, and more than half of them were minors. Now, let me just repeat that. 23% of all sex trafficking victims in US federal court cases were recruited from Meta, and half of them were minors.
Yep. Yeah, and I can go into a little more detail there. So just to quibble with some of the details, because I'm a researcher and that's what we do, it's 23% of all sex trafficking victims in federal court cases whose recruitment locations we know about. So that's not necessarily all of them. And on top of that, it's not necessarily that 50% of those are minors, but 50% of all those whose ages that we know from federal trafficking cases are minors. But all of that is to say that statistic is no less horrifying with those caveats in there, right? And I'll underline it just as the same as you did. It's remarkable that 23% of all sex trafficking victims, even just for those whose recruitment locations we know about, are being recruited on Meta platforms. And I think that's in some ways the distinct contribution of the piece that I did for John's blog, is that in addition to looking at these new unsealed filings, I'm trying to cross-check the information we have there with research into human trafficking by NGOs. So this particular stat comes from the 2023 federal human trafficking report put out by the Human Trafficking Institute in the US. And so they're tracking the information we get from these federal cases. They're saying, what do we know about the victims? Do we know how they're being victimized? Do we know how they're being recruited? And they're breaking down what we know by recruitment location. And so they're finding that across 2019 to 2023, which is the period they're studying here, just under a quarter of all the victims whose recruitment locations we know are being recruited on Meta platforms. And so when you combine that information with the information that we're getting from these unsealed court filings, this horrifying picture emerges, right? Because you understand the scale of the amount of interaction that is not just going unnoticed, but is being actively facilitated by Meta's algorithmic recommendation systems and is being knowingly facilitated by Meta's algorithmic recommendation systems. You have that scale in the back of your head, and then you see that that has real consequences. I mean, it's not as if we don't know what the harms here are because of work in human trafficking research, which has found that people are being recruited on these platforms. It's not just a matter, as horrible as this already is, of receiving a sexual message from an adult as a minor. It's a matter of fact that minors and adults are being recruited by traffickers on these platforms. We know that from independent research by NGOs like the Human Trafficking Institute. And so when you understand the scale of this problem from the unsealed filings, and when you combine that with the information we already know about human trafficking, I mean, I was just appalled, especially because after this filing came out, and despite this information about trafficking being out in the open, there was surprisingly little conversation about precisely these details, right? Now, there was quite a bit of coverage of this next detail, which I want to share because it's highly pertinent here. So one piece of information we have from the filing is a deposition from a former head of safety at Meta. And if I could, I'm just going to pull up her name so we understand the scale here.
Yeah, you're allowed to not remember every single detail, mate. There are 5 million words of data in those documents.
But I wish I did. Yeah, here we go. So there's a deposition from Instagram head of I assume former Instagram head of safety and well-being, Vaishnavi Jayakumar. That's quoted.
I'm sorry, I missed the name. Say again.
Yeah, it's Vaishnavi Jayakumar. And so there's a deposition of hers in there where she reveals, and this is the first time this had ever come out in this November 21st filing, that Meta had a 17x strike policy for accounts engaged in the trafficking of humans for sex. So that means that that account had to be reported by another account 17 times to be suspended from the platform, right? And so it's not even just that we're connecting the dots here from, IIC violators and child predators to human traffickers. It's that we know their policies to deal with human trafficking as well, right? And so there's this extraordinary permission structure they're creating for human traffickers to come onto the platform, the algorithmically recommended children to interact with, and then even if it's known that that's happening, even if other accounts are seeing, let's say, public interactions in the comments section on Instagram from child predators and children, they can report the offending account 16 times and nothing will happen, right? And so that was a deliberate policy of Meta's that's confirmed not just by this deposition, but by internal documents as well.
And it follows on to say in those documents to fill in the gap that, and then that's quite extraordinary, right? So the idea is that somebody can send sexual or grooming information to a child and be identified and be warned about it and be identified by somebody else, okay, and do it 16 times and their account not be disabled. And they were told that this was happening. So if they've been caught 16 times, then maybe they go and set up another account, right? But
Yeah,
then it says, but then it says that this process took place because there were statistical data analyses done by internal teams based on growth at Meta, that if they struck these people off and if they stopped this, it would slow down the growth of Meta. And that was deemed not to be a business priority.
absolutely. Right. So it was known that in the particular safety feature that's key here is private by default accounts for teens.
Right.
That had
Let's
been
let's dive into the detail of that. All
sure.
right.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah,
So please explain, because it's not that there isn't a technical capability to fix this. It's
exactly.
a deliberate decision not to use it. So explain to me default by
Private
private
by
by
default.
default and what we actually have. Just explain that to everybody.
Yes. So private by default would just mean that if you're a teen account, if you're under the age window for that, then your account is on all private settings. That means that, strangers can't look. Let's just say you're on Instagram. This is about Instagram mainly. Let's just say you're on Instagram. Adults that you're not connected to, and just any account you're not connected to, they can't message you. They can't look at your photos. They won't be recommended you as a potential follow. And so it was known for years, and research teams were building prototypes of this feature and testing what its impacts would be. It was known that it would prevent a large volume of unwanted messages and recommendations. But like you say, in addition to the safety team at Meta, you also have the growth team, right? And they're often at odds because the growth team is telling leadership, if we've simulated what would happen if we make this feature go live, and we've seen that to do so would mean, X% drop month over month in our engagement metrics, like, monthly active persons, daily active persons. And those are also going to be broken up by age, right? So there's daily active teens, monthly active teens. They're seeing that, if these accounts are made private, then engagement metrics will drop off. And that means that we're going to be paid less by advertisers, because advertisers are paying in part on the basis that they know that placing ads on Meta platforms will mean that they're viewed by X number of people. Right. And so Meta knows that they will be losing money if they make teen accounts private.
And they also know exactly you can buy advertising against underage kids on these platforms. You can actually buy bullet point, I'm targeting 11 to 16-year-olds. So
Absolutely.
So we've got the ability, or sorry, they have the ability, Meta has the ability to flick a switch and decide to effectively make it default or safe, private by default. Now, I think most people, when their children are setting up an account, probably kind of assume that either exists or feel that exists. But that's
Yes.
not what comes out from the court papers, right?
Not at all. And in fact, that's something we actually know a fair amount about as well, is that, so like I said before, now there is a version of private by defaults that went live in late 2024, although it doesn't work very well. And there's been some independent analysis basically testing, do these features really prevent the types of interactions they're meant to? And in a lot of cases, the answer is no. But even putting that aside, in the past, when this was an option and it wasn't automatic for teens, we know that it was almost never used, right? We know that parents that were helping their kids set up accounts almost never knew that this was available. They almost never took advantage of it, even if they did know that it was. And so it's not as if just putting these features out there as an option is really doing much. And I think it's a reality, like you said, that most parents don't think through the details of setting up their children's accounts, optional setting by optional setting. We know that doesn't happen, and they have internal research which shows that doesn't happen, right? And that goes back to the idea that they don't have much of an excuse when it comes to their capability to do this, right? They know that just making these features optional does not lead to them being used. And so they can't, excuse me for, swearing, but cover their asses by saying we let parents do this and they chose not to, because they know that people don't know about these features. And just to go a little bit longer on the same matter of, do they have the capability? That's, of the few critical responses that I got to this article, I got some people saying, we can't prevent every bad thing from happening. right? For Meta to shut down all of these accounts, for Meta to make teen accounts private by default, that would be like if the government set up roadblocks at every street corner and, search people's cars to make sure they aren't carrying contraband or something like that, right? And so, bad things happen in the world. They can't all be prevented. At a certain point, the trade-offs are too large, right? But I think it's really critical to emphasize here that that's not true in this case, right? They have panoptic control over the whole of their platform. Like you put it, it's a matter of flipping a switch to prevent these things from happening. So there really is no real world analog where, oh, they don't know this is happening. Oh, it's too costly to make this happen, or they don't have the capability. It really is a matter of, we can do this, we will not do this because it will reduce engagement from teens who are a key share of the market for us at this point.
All right. So let's talk about something that we're seeing happening in Australia already. So I can see there's quite a lot of people now tuned in. So let's bring you up to speed. So Australia has introduced on the 10th of December, introduced a that required all social media platforms, including all of Meta's platforms, to either delay, delete, the accounts of under 16-year-olds. And it wasn't the responsibility of parents, it was the responsibilities of the platforms. And that was the major change in this law. And it said that we're going to have a series of fines for you if we feel that you're not doing what you're told to do, but you need to do this. Now, the feedback immediately from Meta was, it's not our responsibility, it's the responsibility of Apple and Google, because they run the app stores where people download these apps. They should have the age gating. The Australian government were very clear, no, it's going to be your Meta. Meta then said the abilities and the tools and the ways to do this are not very accurate. We don't know how to make these work. You're saying that we have under 16s. Well, what happens if he's 15 and by the time we turn him off, he's 16? Or there were lots and lots of edge cases being shared. Okay, and that became a whole debate. But the government held firm and basically said, no, it's your responsibility. You do it. And if you do get it wrong, we'll accept that. But you need to have a rapid appeals process. So perhaps users that are thrown off the platform that are 16 have an appeal process. People that are under 16 have an appeals. Everybody has an appeals process, and you have to manage. That's all the onus went to them. But the most interesting part of this is after all of that protestation, after all of that, Meta announced just a few days ago that it had removed more than 500,000 under 16 accounts from the platform. So it wasn't a case of can't, it was a case of won't. And now it's a case of has. And so I think that it's very important to not be lost in the he said, she said. It's very, very easy to kick all this into long grass, and everybody's got a different opinion, and it's very emotional. It can be done, but it chose not to, and now it's been made to. It's done it.
Yes. And there's an analogy to the US with, and the whole world, since this features live beyond the US, with private by default accounts, because it was the same thing where they said, we can't afford to make this change happen. November 2024 rolls around, and they just make the change. And it doesn't seem to have caused the collapse of Meta. I'm not even sure it really hurt their bottom line. So they pretty much always can have the technical capability to make whatever changes they need to abide by new legislation, to abide by what their safety team is telling them is the right thing to do, or the thing that you would need to do to prevent minors from receiving unwanted sexual messages. So it really is never a matter of a lack of capability. It's a lack of willingness. It's a matter of, we don't want to lose the growth. We don't want to lose the money.
Okay, so let's talk a little bit about bottom line. So that's, I think, a really important thing here, because my experience of covering tech now for decades is that this is all about incentives. Okay, these are listed companies with shareholders that have to put shareholders first. That's their fiduciary responsibility. They are hyper growth businesses in monopoly positions. They are propping up entire stock markets, with their scale. Meta derives, I think, 99% of its revenue from advertising. It needs to know as much data as it can on everyone. to be able to target and optimize that advertising and charge the highest fees. In the past 3 or 4 quarters, it's been working really hard to increase the number of ads in every Instagram page. I think it's been going up by about 10% quarter on quarter, the ad load. Yeah. And the price is also going up by 10% because it has a monopoly and it can grind customers into having to pay more money to be able to do this targeting. And as I said, you can target to younger teens, 16-year-olds, 18-year-olds by geography and by behavior and by interest and all sorts of other stuff.
Exactly.
These are all parts of the monopoly. But where they've gotten to, they got to $164 billion last year. But by the time we publish this interview, we will have seen their 2025 results and we'll see this year's numbers, which most people are predicting will be up again. So this is a commercial company with a child protection crisis in its core. And these two things do not play well. We have to make a decision about people or profit. They have to make a decision about people or profit. So I want to get to this question for you, and I'm interested in your thoughts. If 99% of their revenue is coming from advertising, and you think about how much time major global brands spend in protecting their brands, making sure that they are viewed as the best they can be, that they're relevant to their audiences, you'd have to think, and I'm not asking for a science response here, I'm just asking for a knee-jerk one, but you'd have to think that some of these major advertisers that spend billions with this platform are going to hear this data and just go, I'm not sure we want to be associated with that.
I wouldn't want to be associated with it. I mean, I think that, major advertisers can be slow in cases to respond to this type of brand risk because of the scale of the market that they would be losing, right? But as you get more and more intense competition over the social media market, as they realize alternatives are out there, I think at a certain point you begin saying in the boardroom, why do we want to advertise on the platform that is algorithmically connecting children to human traffickers, right? That doesn't seem like a very appealing brand prospect for anyone. And so I do anticipate that you will eventually get a little bit of movement there as some of these revelations actually make it into public consciousness. I don't think that's happened yet. Like I said before, I was pretty surprised at how little some of the details in the specific filing that I'm calling on were picked up in the press. Some of them were, but a lot of the worst ones weren't, in my opinion. And more than that, even when they weren't actually being cross-checked with what we know about the amount of genuine human trafficking victimization happening on Meta platforms. And I think that's the key connection that I'm hoping to help folks make that I don't think they have made yet, is that we know about the scale of genuine human trafficking, not just the risk of human trafficking happening via Meta.
Because these are actual court cases where people have gone to court and given evidence and been found guilty, and they have proven in the court that this child or this minor was targeted, identified, approached, and abused after being found groomed and introduced.
Absolutely.
Via Meta.
Yeah, and like we've been at pains to emphasize, there isn't a matter of factual ambiguity in the background here. We're not making best guesses. We know, like we discussed earlier, that 23% of all sex trafficking victims in federal court cases whose recruitment locations we know about from 2019 to 2023 were recruited from either Facebook or Instagram. That's, almost a quarter of all victims, right? And that's extraordinary, right? And so I think that once you begin to link that information, the evidence we have about genuine human trafficking, not just the risk of human trafficking happening via Meta platforms, once advertisers begin to connect the dots and see that that was happening and is continuing to happen at some scale at the same time that Meta was making a conscious decision to permit the interactions that led in that direction to happen because they were worried about hurting their engagement metrics. Once the sort of full causal chain is connected by people, I think you will see at least some amount of advertiser flight because it's far too big of a brand risk for, I think, anyone to be known to advertise on a company that's connecting children with human traffickers in cases where those children are actually being victimized. And just to say a little bit more on the numbers, something else I'm doing in my essay for After Babel is looking into research about human trafficking prevalence in the United States and trying to give admittedly a very rough tentative guesstimate of, what is the aggregate number of children actually being victimized on Meta platforms. And I came up with a lower bound per year of something like 8,000 children by making some very, very conservative assumptions. And I'm going to caution everyone, because I have to, not to put too much stock in that exact number, but I'm virtually 100% certain that we're talking about numbers in the thousands and not the hundreds. And certainly I think we're talking about numbers above 4 or 5,000, right? So that's happening every year. It's happening as a result of conscious decision making by Meta leadership and Meta's growth team, despite what they've been hearing for years on end from their research teams. And so I think it would be crazy if you didn't see some level of serious public advertiser concern over those facts, because they are facts, in the near future.
Let's talk about something you just raised. It's absolutely pertinent, which is the surprising lack of mainstream media coverage of this. So, as an investigative reporter of more than 30 years, one of the biggest challenges about doing that job is that you come under massive amounts of legal jeopardy, you come under massive amounts of pressure from people not to do this. And most of the time, when you're working for a large global media company, you have the coverage of the media company. That's your shield of protection. So you can brought into investigations just like this. What's been really interesting, though, is that ultimately the news media of the past 20 years has been pretty much funded by advertising. Less so now, but certainly was a long time ago. And so now these companies, Google, Meta, Apple, Google and Meta mainly, are the major advertising companies. And so the amount of advertising that goes to publishers has been diminishing. As a result, publishers have to keep their audiences large, or otherwise they can't get enough advertising to fund their work. And the way they keep their audiences large is by relying on search and, to a large extent, relying on social. And social, by and large, is Meta. Okay. And so what you have is a risk of capture for the industry, because we just had 3 antitrust cases and Google lost all 3 of them. You barely saw coverage in the majority of newspapers, okay, or news brands, digital news brands. We now have this situation with Meta. The data is out there. It's in the public arena. Again, we're not seeing a lot of coverage because a lot of them are very reliant on it. This is a very severe risk to the fourth estate. So hopefully, the kind of work that we're doing can push that agenda forward and get this information into the public arena. But I do think that we need to look at the incentives. I talk about this a lot, right? If you are a defunded media industry and you're hopelessly reliant on these platforms, and these platforms are the people conducting these behaviors, life becomes extremely difficult.
Yeah, absolutely. And that I'm sure that at some level that's cooling the amount of coverage that's happening, even if it's not an explicit conversation, that we can't say anything bad about Meta. Over time, these sorts of practices just get baked into institutional DNA, that it's like you can only go after, major multinational corporations who really control our fate as an institution, so many times before that starts to hurt us.
To be fair, I will call out a couple of publications that have done some really good work in this. The Verge has done a great job. The Washington Post has done a great job. The Wall Street Journal has done a terrific job. The New York Times has done some really good work in this space. But one thing I will say, and it comes back to something we said earlier on, which is that the true power to make the change here is really with governments. And so I think we have something like 17 or 18 global governments are now planning to follow the Australian lead here. If Meta has genuinely removed 500,000 child accounts under 16, which we have to rely on their numbers, but those are the numbers that if they have, that basically means that the vast majority of under 16s in Australia are now off these platforms. And if 17 other countries do the same thing, then it's going to impact on Meta's growth, whether they choose to or not. But the thing I really do want to call out, though, is that the people that really do hold the control here and the sway are the advertising industry. The agencies, the global holding groups, can choose where they place their advertising. And if they know this stuff is happening, they might want to think about that. Similarly, if you're a major brand and you're advertising on Meta, you might want to stop and consider whether or not you want to attach your brand to this. Okay. And then if you're not going to advertise there, where will you advertise? Well, you'll advertise in premium publishing and news content. And so there is an opportunity here to redress the balance and provide some kind of structure of protection between the kind of the bad behavior and those who seek to report. Now, I can see we've got quite a group of people sitting here listening in now. If anybody's got any questions, we'd very much like to answer them for you. We're going to keep talking for about another 5 or 10 minutes, but if there's any questions you've got, please just put them here in the message, and we'll do our best to respond to it. So, just quickly, Nathan, tell me, what were the things that you saw here in the data that really leapt out at you? Things that perhaps other people weren't absolutely obvious.
Yeah, absolutely. So one thing I'll add, and we haven't quite talked about this yet, is that the filing goes into a ton of detail about Meta's outreach and sort of marketing efforts to get teens
Oh,
involved
yes.
in the platform.
I
Um,
saw this.
yeah,
Greenwashing.
yeah,
AstroTurf.
exactly. Yes, yeah. And on top of that, making connections with institutions in the United States that deal with schooling, deal with parenting, including the National PTA, the Parent Teachers Association. One of the wildest, I think, details in this filing is that Meta was paying them a six-figure sum to do outreach on their behalf at the same exact time that all of this was happening. Not only that, but they were using, the sheer surveillance that power that they have, including over children, to figure out, where kids were going to school, what time would it be optimal to sort of blast them notifications to make sure they would all be looking at their phones and on their platforms at the same time. And so, the first thing that stood out to me is just that the sheer sort of, invasive, awesome power of the platform is really on full display in the filing I looked at least, and how that fed into the narrative of the numbers about inappropriate contact between adults and children is, I think, just as harrowing as some of those numbers themselves, right? The fact that, Meta really thinks about and thought about, especially from this period of 2015 onward, and especially after 2018 when they started to compete with TikTok, how do we get kids into our system, right? And they're, simultaneously thinking, how do we get kids into our system? And, well aware that to get kids into your system will mean increasing the amount of interaction between those kids and child predators, right? So there's this, just really sort of, amoral, really kind of disgusting and awful juxtaposition here, right? Where there's this just massive push to get kids on the platform at the same time as there is safety research going on surrounding what the consequences of that will be. And, a couple other just sort of Orwellian details I remember encountering in the filing were that Meta was doing these like safety road shows where they would have Meta employees go into high schools and talk about like how to be safe online. But really, a lot of these things are coming out of their marketing budget. On top of that, they're hiring teen influencers, right? So 13 to 17-year-olds to sort of get teens interested in logging on to the platform. So in terms of what initially stood out to me, the raw numbers are pretty terrifying, but it was also the juxtaposition of sort of knowing what the raw numbers were and nonetheless going ahead with this massive push to sort of drive teens onto the platform, including by using teens themselves, right? By hiring teen influencers, by going into schools, and by paying the Parent Teacher Association, and also Scholastic, which is a huge organization in the United States, large amounts of money to do outreach on Meta's behalf, right? So there's a real sense of sort of capturing even institutions that ostensibly are oriented around kids' best interests, around schools' best interests, and directing all of them towards this sort of vast, almost like nation state scale project of getting kids into our platforms, despite knowing all that they knew at the time about how that would increase contact between child predators and children, human traffickers, and children. And so that's some of what really stood out to me.
And all of this is in the court papers brought by, I think, 6 US school districts.
Yes.
These are teachers and organizations representing teachers across a vast swathe of America who basically sued or are in the process of suing Meta, arguing that they can't do their jobs in school teaching children because the children are distracted, upset, suffering mental health crises. The teachers say that they're having to spend resources that they want to spend on education on protecting damaged children that have been damaged by social, and they've had enough. And now they want to take a class action. It's not a class action, it's an action of these 6 US school districts against Meta to argue that there has to be change, or otherwise it's going to damage their abilities to do the jobs in the school. Which is quite astonishing, isn't it? When you've got, astroturfing with school organizations, this
Yeah.
whole thing is so messy and so mucky, but it's not getting exposed to the world, so we're not getting it fixed.
No, yeah, and I think that, goes back to part of why I really wanted to write this piece, was it became clear, within the week following these filings coming out, that a lot of the key elements of the story were being missed. So I saw a lot of stories with this 17X strike policy, which is obviously terrible. I think that's the one that
Yeah,
got sort of the most mind share, which is
it is.
unsurprising, right? But nonetheless, we didn't see that many stories surrounding this number that I started our conversation with, recommending 1.4 million child predators to children in a single day at one point, or, 2 million minors in the past 3 months. I mean, some of that scale didn't make it into a lot of major publications. Neither did some of the details about Meta's paying Scholastic and the Parent Teacher Association. And I think most importantly, neither did previous research done by folks at the Human Trafficking Institute and others that sort of help us actually substantiate the downstream impact here. Because I think for a lot of people, as awful as it is, it's one thing to go, okay, kids are being recommended adult accounts. That's awful. Maybe they think, oh, they should know not to interact with these people. Obviously, they don't in practice. But setting that aside, I still think for a lot of people, it's another thing to actually know, like we've tried to underline, that almost a quarter of victims in federal human trafficking cases whose recruitment locations we know are being recruited on Facebook and Instagram. And these are people that have been victimized in one way or another, abused, raped, whatever it's going to be. Those are people that are entering into that awful situation because they were on Meta platforms, in many cases at least. And so I think that second piece
Yeah.
of the equation of cross-checking all of this with research that's going on by NGOs and by academics on the prevalence of human trafficking on the internet, I think that's a key connection that's not fully been made in a lot of cases.
So I went away after reading your research and went and found the 5 million words of evidence, and I sat down and read it.
Yeah.
And to your point, the media companies aren't going to sit down and read 5 million words. They're not. They don't have time. And so it falls to you, and I guess to me as well, to actually spend our time diving through those documents. Now, I'm going to round up because we've been going now
Sure.
it's 50 minutes, but I want to just make it clear where kind of Meta is at the moment in its kind of existence. So this is a 20-year-old company that has grown from starting off in college dorms to being a $165 billion company. And as I said, by the time we do this report, it will have reported its financials again, middle of next week, and we'll know what its 2025 numbers are. So it's utterly dominant in its space. Facebook was starting to slow down its growth a few years ago. And as a result, it bought Instagram for $1 billion, and then it bought WhatsApp for $19 billion, which expanded the company from just its Facebook audience to having a much bigger US audience, and then to having a much bigger global audience, and then expanding into other platforms. It's very hard in building its youth audience. Now, that came up at an antitrust trial last year. Meta was by the Federal Trade Commission in the US with the intention of breaking up Meta and separating those 3 businesses. Instagram would be spun off, WhatsApp would be spun off, Facebook would continue to be operated by Meta. But the judge decided not to do that and decided it wasn't a monopoly and allowed them to continue because it was now under challenge from TikTok and others. Okay. And yet these court papers in this completely separate court action brought by the schools says that the reason Meta's doing a lot of this is because of the threat of losing market share to TikTok. Now,
Yes.
there's also a separate states case brought by, I think, 33 US states that is also got a huge tome of internal documents from Meta, which will go public later this year, which will then further focus on harms, privacy, alleging that state privacy and federal privacy rules have been bypassed. And so Meta's going to spend most of this year, okay, or a lot of this year, a lot of Meta's attention is going to be on defending itself in court actions. But Nathan, I just want to say I commend you on your work. It was
Thank you.
I thank you very much indeed for it. And I'm going to leave the final words with you.
Okay. Um, I think I would just say, if you're hearing this, tell people about it, talk about it, right? Like if you're appalled by these numbers, make sure other people know because, like you said, there's sometimes some incentive misalignment in terms of the folks who have the responsibility and the capability to make sure this information gets out there. And so I think in many cases it falls to people, sort of doing independent research like me and maybe other folks on sort of newer platforms like Substack and also their audiences to make sure that this information gets out because I guess why I really went down the path like I've said of writing this article is I was like, why is no one talking about this? I mean, why is no one seeing the sheer scale and the sort of knowing scale of the harm being done to kids in this awful way on these platforms and making a massive stink about it? I mean, it wasn't really happening. And so I think that's the one thing I would leave folks with is just whatever part you can play and in sort of spreading this information, whether that's sending this video around, whether it's sharing some of the details that we've gone over or sharing my article, that would be lovely. And I think really of serious kind of moral import as well.
Thank you for that. Where can people find your work?
They can find my work on my Substack, which is called Arachnate, where I cover wide range of issues. I sort of write some pieces that are a little more on the journalistic side, some a little more academic, but a major theme is sort of how rapid technological change is shaping social relations in the Western world, is shaping how governments work, is shaping how people relate to one another. And, I think that's really sort of covers a lot of the sort of fundamental questions of our time is we need to be talking about how we, live in a world that is in many ways governed by these private institutions now, social media platforms and other major tech companies. And, at some level, this is what you get when that happens, right? And that's something we need to be having a larger conversation about.
Understood. I'd also recommend to anybody that's interested following Jonathan Haidt's Substack, which is called After Babel. And as I said earlier on, I have this full evidence bundle. I will be breaking it down case by case by case by case by case over the months to come. And I thank you all. I'm sorry it's such a topic, but I hope that opening eyes will help us lead to meaningful change. And I also commend government for having the courage to step up and be first at this. Thank you very much indeed, everybody, for tuning in. All the best. Thank you.
Thanks, Ricky.